The world had a harsh, rattling sound to it, one that was deafening even inside his ship as it plummeted toward the alien planet below. After several minutes of fiery descent, the jolt as he hit the ground was almost welcome, despite the crunch of something snapping under the impact. He sat for a moment, letting the silence settle back in, then cracked open the emergency latch. Outside, the air smelled faintly of something sweet, mixed with the dry earth. After a quick systems check, which, predictably, revealed he was thoroughly stranded, he climbed out of the wreckage and scanned the horizon for signs of life or, ideally, anything that looked like it could help him communicate with his ship or send for help. Instead, all he saw was a range of grassy hills stretching into distant, craggy mountains. He sighed, resigned to the likelihood that he'd be here for a while. Then, a shadow fell across him. Slowly he looked up, his jaw dropping as he took in the sight of towering figures closing in. Giant women. Easily 4 times his height, they moved with ease, their limbs graceful and powerful, their faces a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't quite place. Before he could process much more, one of them leaned down, her massive eyes locked onto his face, and whispered something in a language that sounded like a blend of musical notes and growls. He tried his best to respond, stammering through a greeting, but the woman only tilted her head, clearly fascinated. Another giantess, this one with dark hair flowing like a river down her back, joined her and made an excited gesture, pointing at him and speaking in rapid, eager tones. A few others joined in, their voices filling the air with an energetic hum, all while he stood frozen, half wondering if this was some hallucination from hitting his head. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the giants seemed to make a decision. One of them reached down, her hand coming toward him, and he flinched, instinctively closing his eyes as she scooped him up as gently as if he were a small animal. When he dared to peek, he saw that he was now cradled in her massive hands as they began to move toward the horizon, their long legs covering ground at an unbelievable speed. The giants brought him into what looked like a village, but on a massive scale. Everything around him, the huts, the tools, even the decorations, was built to a proportion that made him feel like a doll in a playhouse. He was set down on a sort of platform, and the giants gathered around him in a semicircle, their eyes alight with fascination and something almost hopeful. One giant woman, who seemed to hold a position of authority given the way the others looked to her, stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was low and soothing, as though she were coaxing him to understand. She placed a hand over her chest, a gesture that seemed both welcoming and a little formal, and said a word that sounded like a name or title. He attempted to mimic her gesture and repeated the word back to her, feeling absurd as he did. But she smiled, apparently pleased with his effort. Encouraged, he tried introducing himself, saying his name slowly and clearly. Her brow furrowed as she listened, but after a moment she nodded, repeating his name in a way that sounded more musical, stretching out the syllables as if tasting each one. Then the real shock came. She said something to the other women, and there was an immediate response, gasps, a ripple of excitement, and wide smiles all around. The leader pointed at him, saying something in a tone that suggested pride and awe, and he felt an odd mix of pride and terror as their gaze intensified. He didn't understand a word of what was happening, but the impression was impossible to miss. They were looking at him as though he were some kind of miracle, something they'd been waiting for, something they needed. Desperation took over, and he tried asking questions in English, in broken attempts to communicate even basic words. "Help, stranded, need to get back, ship?" He gestured toward the direction he thought he'd landed, but the women only smiled kindly and shook their heads. The leader gestured for silence and continued speaking, her tone soothing, almost reverent. She looked back to her people, nodding her head, and then, with a gentle authority, she leaned down and touched his shoulder. She said something in a gentle, almost pleading tone, then pointed at herself, the other women, and then made a circle in the air around them. She finished by pointing at him, nodding hopefully. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what she meant. Then it hit him. They wanted him to help them, somehow? Save them? But from what? He tried to ask, but the words stuck in his throat. The language barrier made everything surreal. Suddenly, a few of the giant women began to mime out gestures, a sort of pantomime. They cupped their hands, made motions that looked like cradling something small, their gazes darting between him and their gestures. Realization dawned on him in waves. They weren't just asking for his help, they were asking him to become part of them, their future. He stammered, "Wait, you mean you, me, kids?" He could barely process the thought, let alone voice it. But their earnest expressions, the hope, the reverence, these weren't just giant women, they were a people with a deep need, looking at him like he was some kind of answer to a problem he barely understood. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it all but stopped himself, seeing the sincerity in their faces. One of the women, noticing his hesitation, offered a gentle, encouraging smile. She stepped forward and placed a massive, warm hand on his shoulder. He felt himself flush, the heat of embarrassment meeting a bizarre sense of responsibility. Somehow, he had ended up on this strange planet, and they had chosen him, whether he understood it or not. As the dust settled from the arrival of their mysterious savior, the giant women of the tribe welcomed him to a grand feast. Though to him, it felt more like a pageant of awkward curiosity. Plates the size of his torso held food he could barely recognize, and bowls of strange, aromatic liquid were passed around, each one big enough to drown in. They seemed delighted by his bewildered expressions, laughing among themselves as he eyed each enormous platter with caution. One woman brought him a small, glistening morsel, clearly an attempt to make him comfortable with their food. He took a bite and, to his surprise, found it sweet and warm, sparking an enthusiastic cheer from the crowd around him. Encouraged, he tried another dish and nodded approvingly, earning even more delighted laughter and a few enthusiastic pats on the back that nearly knocked him off the bench. Their excitement was palpable, and for a brief moment, he felt like an honored guest rather than an accidental visitor. As the night wore on, he noticed the tribe's leader, the tall, dignified woman who had initially approached him, speaking to several others in animated whispers. She gestured toward him frequently, her voice taking on a tone that sounded both serious and ceremonial. With each mention, the group's eyes would widen, and they would cast glances his way, some nodding with thoughtful expressions, others smiling as though he had already passed some unseen test. Suddenly, with a clap of her hands, the leader drew everyone's attention, and the crowd fell silent. She turned to him, her expression calm yet hopeful, and began to speak. Her voice was melodic and steady, and she seemed to be giving some kind of important speech. Although he understood nothing of her words, her gestures were clear. She placed a hand over her heart, then motioned toward him, the food, and finally, her people. Her gaze never wavered, and he could feel the weight of her words even as they flew over his head. Then came the trials. To demonstrate his worthiness, he was asked, no, expected, to take part in what he could only guess were their courtship rituals. One of the giant women, eyes alight with a playful challenge, motioned him to a flat stone slab. She made a gesture that looked like lifting, pointing first at a stone and then at him. It didn't take him long to realize they wanted him to show his strength. With a deep breath, he approached the smallest stone and wrapped his arms around it, straining to lift it off the ground. It barely budged. The woman watching him tilted her head, clearly amused, and gave him an encouraging nod, as if he simply needed more motivation. Feeling ridiculous but determined not to disappoint, he strained harder, pulling with everything he had. After a few seconds of embarrassing grunting and sweating, the stone moved, barely an inch, but enough to draw an impressed "ooh" from the crowd. They applauded as if he had lifted a mountain. The trials continued, each one more bizarre than the last. He was handed a massive cup filled with a thick, bubbling liquid that smelled faintly of berries and spice. The crowd chanted something in unison, urging him on, and he took a cautious sip, instantly regretting it. The liquid burned and fizzled down his throat, leaving a strange, tingling warmth in his belly. Still, their encouraging cheers spurred him on, and he managed a few more gulps, eliciting approving shouts from all around. Through gestures and pantomime, the women began teaching him basic phrases in their language. They pointed to themselves, saying words he assumed were their names, then looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to repeat. Each time he spoke, his pronunciation was met with stifled laughter and whispers, but they seemed delighted by his efforts, even if he often butchered the words. He tried introducing himself, saying his name slowly and clearly, but they struggled to replicate the sounds, turning his name into a string of musical notes that barely resembled the original. As he stumbled through their language, he realized that they weren't just laughing at him, they were laughing with him, finding his attempts endearing rather than offensive. Each botched word seemed to win him more favor, and soon, the giant women were trying to teach him even more elaborate phrases. One phrase, in particular, caused a ripple of giggles every time he tried to repeat it, and eventually, the leader herself stepped forward to show him the proper pronunciation. When he finally managed to get it right, the crowd erupted in applause, and the leader gave him an approving nod. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and connection he hadn't expected. For the first time since crash landing, he felt less like an outsider and more like, well, something between a guest and a curious newcomer trying his best to fit in. By the end of the evening, the leader had drifted close to him, her expression softer than before. She spoke a few words in a tone that seemed almost affectionate, patting his shoulder in a gesture he was beginning to understand as one of approval. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, and he found himself blushing, caught off guard by the look in her eyes. It was a look he had seen before but never expected to find here, on a strange planet, among beings who could crush him with one hand. The feast drew to a close, and as the giants dispersed to their various dwellings, he was led to a small, by their standards, tent outfitted with a bed of furs and blankets. As he settled in for the night, his thoughts drifted back to the leader's gaze, her approving smile, and the gentle touch on his shoulder. He was beginning to realize that his role here was far more significant than he'd anticipated. The tribe didn't just see him as an answer to a problem, they saw him as someone with a place among them, a role he hadn't yet figured out. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the furs and the gentle hum of the distant laughter lull him to sleep. In the back of his mind, he knew tomorrow would bring more rituals, more trials, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something he couldn't quite name. The morning dawned with an energy that seemed to surge through the village. He was barely awake when he found himself ushered into the middle of the gathering area, surrounded by the tribe's women, each watching him with eager anticipation. At the front stood the leader, her expression one of calm but undeniable purpose. She stepped forward, her gaze soft yet commanding, and began to speak in the rich, flowing cadence of her language. Though he couldn't understand her words, her gestures, indicating him, the tribe, and the vast sky above, were clear. This was an important moment. Suddenly, the leader gestured to one of the women, who produced a large, ornate garment that looked like a mix between armor and ceremonial attire. The design was intricate, adorned with shimmering threads and symbols he couldn't decipher, and he realized with a jolt that this was meant for him. Before he could protest, several of the women helped him into the outfit, their hands carefully adjusting the fabric and metal, making him feel both honored and trapped in equal measure. Once suited up, he was led to a central spot where the leader stood waiting. She held out her hands, inviting him to take them, and he did so hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. Her eyes met his with a mixture of respect and something warmer, something he couldn't quite define. She spoke to him, her voice soft and almost intimate, as if trying to convey a message that words alone couldn't express. With a smile, she motioned to the crowd and, to his surprise, they began chanting in unison, a rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate with the earth beneath his feet. The leader raised his hands in hers, her gaze unwavering, and he realized she was offering him some kind of proposal. The weight of the moment hit him hard. This wasn't just an introduction or a friendly gesture. She was formally asking him to join them, to be part of their lives and, from what he could gather, to contribute in a way that would secure the tribe's future. The intensity in her eyes left no room for doubt. This was both a privilege and a responsibility. He hesitated, the enormity of it all settling on his shoulders. Then, with a deep breath, he gave her a small nod, agreeing to this commitment that he didn't fully understand. The crowd erupted in cheers, and he was pulled into an unexpected hug from the leader, her arms enveloping him in a warmth that made his earlier hesitation seem distant. When she released him, there was a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes, a look that said she had been waiting a long time for this moment. The celebration that followed was even grander than the previous night's feast. Food was brought out in abundance, and the tribe gathered around, showering him with smiles and laughter. He attempted to keep up with their customs, participating in dances and accepting gifts, though the oversized portions and elaborate gestures often left him feeling overwhelmed. The women seemed to enjoy his bewildered reactions, and more than once he caught the leader watching him, her gaze both proud and tender. As the day wore on, he began to understand the significance of his role here. The leader and the tribe had chosen him as more than just an honored guest. They saw him as a bridge between their world and some larger destiny. Though he still struggled with the language, their gestures and expressions conveyed a level of acceptance and expectation that transcended words. He felt a strange sense of belonging he hadn't anticipated, as if he had finally stumbled upon a place where he was not only needed but valued. At one point, the leader approached him with a serious expression and gestured for him to follow her. She led him to a secluded area near a large tree, its branches creating a shaded canopy overhead. They sat together, and she began speaking softly, pointing to the ground, the sky, and finally to him. Her tone was gentle, almost affectionate, and he found himself captivated, caught in the depth of her gaze. She reached out and took his hand, guiding it to a pendant she wore around her neck. It was a simple yet beautiful piece, carved with symbols that seemed to tell a story. Her fingers closed around his, her eyes meeting his with a look that was both intense and vulnerable. She didn't need to say a word. He understood that this was a token of trust, a symbol of the bond they were about to forge. Feeling the weight of her expectation, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and she smiled, a smile that held gratitude, relief, and a trace of joy. It was then that he realized this wasn't just about duty. There was a real connection forming between them, something that transcended language and custom. The leader's expression softened, and for a brief moment, he felt as though they were the only two people in the universe. As they returned to the village, the crowd welcomed them back with knowing smiles and approving nods. It was clear that the leader's decision had the full support of her people. He found himself caught up in the joy and energy of the celebration, his earlier doubts melting away. For the first time, he began to see this place not as a temporary refuge, but as a potential home. In the final hours of the evening, the leader guided him to a place of honor by her side, and they sat together, watching as the stars began to appear in the sky. She pointed out constellations, her voice soft and reverent, and he realized that this was her way of sharing her world with him, inviting him to be part of something bigger than himself. Her hand rested lightly on his, and they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their new bond settling between them like a gentle warmth. He felt a mixture of awe and contentment as he looked at her, realizing that his journey had taken him to a place he could never have imagined. This tribe, these women, had welcomed him not just as a visitor but as family, offering him a place among them. The leader glanced at him, her eyes shining with quiet happiness, and in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. In the days that followed, he found himself embracing his role with a surprising sense of ease. The tribe's acceptance had given him a new perspective, and he dedicated himself to learning more about their culture. He worked alongside them, watching as they showed him the intricacies of their daily life, and they marveled at the skills he introduced in return. While he wasn't about to fulfill the expectations they initially had for him in a traditional sense, he found other ways to contribute that left everyone content, even impressed. He began helping the tribe by sharing techniques he'd learned back on Earth, introducing concepts like sustainable crop rotation and irrigation methods. To them, it seemed like a kind of magic. To him, it was simple practicality. Together, they planted fields with new methods that promised richer yields, and he helped them create a nutrient-rich fertilizer from materials around their land. These small changes felt monumental to the tribe, and their gratitude was overwhelming. The leader, who was always close by, took a special interest in his work. She observed his methods with curiosity, and their conversations, though limited by the language barrier, grew more natural. Each day, they shared moments of laughter and quiet understanding, as she watched him try to teach the younger members how to measure and mark planting rows. Her smiles became softer, her touch on his arm lingering a moment longer than necessary, and he felt a warmth that made his days among them seem not just bearable but genuinely fulfilling. One afternoon, as they were testing a new tool he'd devised for carrying water, a group of women approached him with a look he had come to recognize, teasing and playful. They gestured to the leader and him, speaking in their musical language with grins that left no question as to the subject of their conversation. The leader tried to shoo them away, but her laughter betrayed her amusement. He joined in, shaking his head, laughing, and feeling for the first time like he truly belonged. It wasn't long before the tribe's gentle nudging turned into a more overt show of approval. At mealtimes, the women would make playful comments, gesturing between him and the leader, their laughter ringing out across the gathering place. Even without fully understanding their language, he caught the meaning behind their words and gestures. The tribe wanted to see them together, not just as allies or leaders but as something more. It was a notion that, surprisingly, he no longer found strange. He'd grown fond of the leader, her quiet strength, her kindness, and the way she looked at him as if he were more than just a visitor. As the weeks went by, he and the leader spent more time alone, talking late into the night by the fire. She'd tell stories of her people's history, weaving tales with the little he understood, and he shared stories of Earth, his voice carrying a note of nostalgia. Their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated, a connection that went beyond language, a silent promise they both felt but didn't speak aloud. One evening, under the wide, starlit sky, the leader brought him to a secluded clearing. She took his hand, her touch gentle but purposeful, and led him to a small alcove where the tribe's sacred symbols were carved into the stone. She pointed to one symbol in particular, a symbol he recognized as the same one that had adorned the pendant she wore. She placed her hand over the carving, her eyes meeting his with a gravity that left him breathless. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't just about him being there to save the tribe, this was about forging a future. She was asking him to be part of her life, of her people, in a way that was profound and real. He took her hand, matching her solemn gaze, and nodded, feeling the weight of the commitment he was making. She smiled, a smile so radiant that it left him without words, and pulled him into an embrace that felt like home. From then on, their lives intertwined in a way that felt natural, as if they had always been meant to find each other. He became part of the village, not as a savior but as a partner, a companion who worked and laughed and lived among them. The tribe welcomed this bond, celebrating it in quiet ways, through knowing smiles and the occasional teasing remark. The leader and he became an inseparable pair, and together, they led the tribe with a strength born of unity. The seasons changed, and he found himself deeply embedded in the rhythms of their life, the people, the land, and most of all, the leader who had brought him in. Their connection was more than just the survival of her people. It was about building something that would last, a legacy of resilience and hope. And though he never could have anticipated it, he realized that this place, this life, had become home. As they stood together one evening, watching the sun set over the vast plains, he felt a quiet happiness settle within him. She looked at him, her eyes filled with the same gentle affection she'd shown since that first day, and he knew without words that he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Together, they faced the horizon, side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together.